Well, thank you very much. I suppose I could just let everyone out real early by saying nothing happened. It was a status quo election. Democrats went in holding the White House and the Senate. They left holding the White House and the Senate. Republicans went into the election holding the House. They left holding the House. Or I could make a slight joke and I could say there's bad news and good news. The bad news is the big government pro-regulation statist won, but the good news is that the other pro-regulation big government statist lost. But that might be a little bit simple. So let me go ahead and break down and discuss the political implications, the policy implications, and the economy implications, and do that all in the space of about 25 minutes so we can have time for some Q&A. And I'll start with the political implications, just in case you're a political junkie, you like that kind of thing. And I'll give you just a brief look at what some of the Republicans in Washington are worried about after the election. These are the things they're chewing over right now. This is the period of backstabbing, postmortems, who's at fault, and you want to always try to spin it so that if only everyone had listened to you, the election would have turned out differently. The number one issue that I think Republicans are worried about is the issue of dependency. If you followed the election, you may have seen that Romney got in trouble when he was surreptitiously taped talking about the 47%. And 47%, that is the share of U.S. households that pay no federal income tax. And so the theory is those are the free riders who would automatically vote for Obama. That's actually inaccurate because 47% includes retirees that were in the private sector their whole lives. They don't see themselves as part of the moocher class. The 47% includes a lot of young people, young families just starting out in the workforce. They maybe have a couple of kids, and the combination of having relatively modest incomes and having a couple of kids might wipe out their federal income tax liability. They don't see themselves as part of the moocher class. So the 47% is not really the right number. The number that I would prefer, although even that's not the right number, is the share of households that get benefits from the government. That's not 47%, it's 49%, sort of coincidental that they're so close together. Obviously there's a lot of overlap between those types of households. But even that 49% number, getting government benefits, isn't really determinative. Because let's say you're a senior citizen, you worked in the private sector your whole life, now you're getting Social Security, just like you're not a federal income taxpayer, you're a beneficiary of the federal government, but again, you don't see yourself as part of the moocher class, and there's lots of other people that would be like that. Let's say that you have a parent who's in a nursing home, getting paid for by Medicaid. Well, that's just the reality of the way government programs are structured in the U.S. You probably have very little options not to be in that program. Now, having said that the 47% number isn't determinative and that the 49% number isn't determinative, the fact that those numbers every year are increasing is a problem for the Republican Party. If you go back to, say, 1980, the share of households getting a check from the government wasn't 49%, it was around 33%. The share of households not paying federal income tax, I think was around 22%, but I don't have that number on the tip of my tongue, but it was much, much lower than it is today. So as we go up with those numbers year after year after year, obviously there's some point where the people in those numbers who actually are part of the moocher class, as they become larger and larger and larger, it becomes a big challenge for the Republican Party. And they're trying to figure out, what does that mean? Where are we? Where is the tipping point? No one really knows, but those are the questions they're looking at. The second big challenge is a demographic one. Demographic not in the sense of age, but in terms of primarily ethnicity. Republicans have major problems with black, Hispanic, and Asian voters. And as the share of the white vote in America has gone from somewhere in the upper 80s to now down somewhere, I didn't see the final breakdown, but everyone was expecting somewhere around 73, 74% now. If minorities overwhelmingly vote for the Democrats and the share of the white vote is shrinking, Republicans have to win, in effect, 2/3, 70, 75%. Obviously the math changes with each election, but as America becomes less and less of a majority white nation, that puts a big, big burden on the Republican Party if they can't figure out how to reach minority voters, they better figure out how to win 80% of the white vote, and that's not going to happen, obviously, because there's a certain amount of people in the white community who are part of the moocher class, part of the dependency class, government workers, academics, and others that overwhelmingly vote left-wing. Another political implication is that luck matters. Republicans had a very, very weak field to run this year against a candidate who, although his economic policies had not been successful, remained personally popular, or maybe even not personally popular, but the American people did not want to throw out the first black president. So in effect, whoever the Republican nominee was going to have an extra high burden to say, not just, oh, the economy's bad, but the economy's bad, and do something that the press is going to call you racist for doing. And people don't like to be called racist. Even if their vote wasn't racist in the slightest, they did not want to vote against Obama. I think that was part of it as well. And then the final political implication is about 2016, but I'm actually going to save that for the end and talk about the policy implications and the economy implications first. On policy, let's actually walk through real quickly some of the issues that Congress and the White House are going to have to face. The first is the fiscal cliff. But let me sort of preface this by saying what we have in the U.S. right now on all the issues we could possibly discuss is gridlock. Everyone thinks gridlock is bad. It's not. Gridlock is what our founding fathers specifically set up when we broke free from some nation, I forget which one it was, but our founding fathers set up a system where if you read the Federalist Papers, they wrote about factionalism. They wanted there to be separation of powers, as we call our system, in order for there to be fighting between the House and the Senate, and the House and the Senate versus the White House, and of course the Supreme Court being the third branch of government. They wanted all this dispersed power precisely because they didn't want it to be easy for politicians to agree to do things. Because they thought that government action, almost by definition, would be a threat to liberty. And they were right. And the idea of having separation of powers meant they can't do anything. And for the last 2 years, ever since Republicans took the House in 2010, for the most part, Congress hasn't done anything. And that's certainly a lot better than what happened in Obama's first 2 years when government was doing things. Now, for the next 2 years, government isn't going to do anything. And when I say isn't going to do anything, they're obviously going to do lots of things, but it's very unlikely that there'll be any major new initiatives going through, although I will talk about the possibility of a so-called grand bargain on fiscal policy. But again, keep in mind that we have gridlock, so in the short run, the election was good, in the sense that it's going to be there won't be some big, massive new Obamacare equivalent piece of legislation on whatever policy area you can think of. Now, in the long run, I should say, gridlock is a challenge. Why is it a challenge in the long run? Because the U.S. right now, baked into the cake, because of our demographics, because of entitlements, the U.S. is going to become Greece. Now, by the way, the UK is also going to become Greece. The Bank for International Settlements had a very sobering study back in July of 2010 where they looked at the long-run unfunded liabilities of various countries. And Japan was the worst. So if you can short an entire nation, short Japan. But the two worst Western nations were the US and the UK. Worse than Greece, worse than Italy, worse than Spain, worse than Portugal. The US and the UK, aren't we lucky to be linked arm in arm as we sort of march toward fiscal chaos? So, in a parliamentary system, obviously the government can wake up one day and completely change government policy. So in theory, the UK can do something dramatic to avoid the fiscal chaos that is built into your system. In the US, our fiscal chaos will be harder to avoid because somehow we're going to have to get the House and the Senate and the White House to agree to make changes. And of course, normally when politicians all agree to do things, they agree to make things worse, not better. So we have two challenges to overcome in the US. You only have one challenge to overcome in the UK in that regard. So yes, we do have to worry about gridlock at some point, assuming we want to steer the car away, not from the fiscal cliff, that's actually a minor bump in the road, but from the complete breakdown of a society that a Greek-style fiscal chaos would bring. And by the way, I should say that on those issues of trying to fix entitlements and save the country in the long run, I actually don't think Romney would have been that different from Obama, which is why I joked, but wasn't really joking at the beginning, when I said you had a choice between two pro-regulation, big government status. But let's now look at some of these issues, starting with the fiscal cliff. For those of you who don't follow U.S. politics, and I don't encourage you to pick up the habit, what is the fiscal cliff? The fiscal cliff is simply the fact that on January 1st, we have two big things happening. All the Bush tax cuts expire. So we would have a huge tax increase automatically going into effect. Why on earth would we ever do tax cuts with expiration dates? Quirky American budget rules, but it is what it is. And so unless the House, the Senate, and the White House all agree to do exactly the same thing, we're going to have these automatic tax increases going through. The Keynesians think that's a bad idea because you're withdrawing purchasing power from the economy. The people who actually understand economics think that's a bad idea because you're going to be increasing marginal tax rates on all taxpayers and discouraging work, saving, and investing. In addition to that big automatic tax increase, we also have something called the sequester. The sequester is automatic budget cuts. But I should stress, they're not really automatic budget cuts. They're automatic, but they're not really budget cuts. They're reductions in already scheduled increases. It's sort of the same dishonest process that you all use here in the UK. Oh, we've been cutting budgets year after year after year. Well, you actually open up the UK budget documents and spending is going up year after year after year. Oh, but it's not going up as fast as it would have. Imagine if your spouse went to the store, came back and said, oh, honey, I saved you 500 pounds. Well, great. How'd you do that? Well, I only spent 1,000 instead of 1,500. That's literally the way they budget in the U.S. Congress and in Washington, D.C. So what would happen under the sequester, and this, by the way, is something that was put in when we last increased the debt limit. The Republicans in Congress, this is after they just had the Tea Party election, they were feeling, oh, beating our chest, we're going to be really tough, we're going to extract something from Obama in order to increase the debt limit. Well, what they extracted was the creation of a super committee. The super committee, of course, stalemated and didn't do anything, but the backup to the super committee was to have these automatic spending cuts. And again, there are simply reductions in the increase. Instead of government growing at, say, 5%, maybe it'll only grow 4%. So out of a $4 trillion budget, the sequester is designed to shave $100 billion off of the $4 trillion. And over the next 10 years, if the sequester goes into effect, this is the key number, instead of government growing by $2.1 trillion over the next 10 years, it would grow by only $2 trillion. And that's Washington's idea of savage and draconian and brutal spending cuts. But the politicians, of course, don't want the sequester to happen. Republicans don't want defense programs to be sequestered, and Democrats don't want domestic programs to be sequestered. And so whenever the evil party and the stupid party both have a common goal, they are able to achieve that. It's called bipartisanship when something is really stupid and really evil. So in all likelihood, the sequester will be turned off. That's the phrase they're using for it now, which means we did a debt limit increase and got zero fiscal restraint in exchange, which of course is exactly what I told the Republicans at the time, but they don't listen to me. The bigger issue in the fiscal cliff is not the sequester. We're going to lose on that issue. I'll bet Philip's life on it. I'd almost be willing to bet my life. It's 99.9% certain that the sequester will be turned off. But that 0.001% chance, we're putting you on the train track. But what about the tax increase? That's where the real fight is. Because Obama really has staked out a very firm line. He wants to increase taxes on those evil, bad, awful, rich people, those investors, those entrepreneurs, those small business owners who are the bane of America. Bane, that's a joke, Bain Capital, Romney. In the people don't even get it in the U.S., but I still keep trying and hoping someone will. Republicans, their view is all the tax cuts should be extended. Obama is saying, okay, I'm willing to extend most of the tax cuts, but I do want those rich people to pay more taxes. How is that going to turn out? I suspect Obama will win, unfortunately. And it's kind of puzzling. We had the exact same issue in 2010, where the tax cuts were scheduled to expire. And at the end of 2010, before Republicans had taken over the House, you had Democratic control of the House by a very strong margin, and you had only 42 Republican seats in the Senate, or 41, I forget. And yet Republicans, by holding firm, were able to get all the tax cuts extended. Now they hold the House, they have more seats in the Senate, so you would think if they won back in 2010 with less power, they should certainly win in 2012 with more power. But that assumes that they're not the stupid party, and I'll just leave it at that. The one thing Obama probably can say, he didn't really campaign on much this election other than that Mitt Romney's a rich guy. But he didn't campaign on Obamacare, he didn't campaign on his failed stimulus, but the one thing he did say over and over again, and he perhaps can claim a mandate on, is he did say he wanted to tax those evil, awful, bad rich people. We want fewer rich people in America, is apparently the new mantra. Now, Republicans who won the House, retained the House, can say, well, wait, we campaigned on not increasing taxes on rich people, so, isn't it just a wash? In theory, it's a wash. In reality, Republicans have more power than they had in 2010, but practically speaking, I think Republicans are going to surrender on that issue, unfortunately. What about the grand bargain? Well, this actually might wind up being part of the whole fiscal cliff negotiations. It's uncertain right now, but the grand bargain is the idea that, gee, can't we all just get along? Can't we sort of send the senior, mature leaders from both parties into a locked room, away from the turmoil of politics, and they can hammer out in good spirit and fairness a deal where both sides give up something? That's sort of the rhetoric you get in Washington. In reality, every time we have one of these so-called budget summits, grand bargains, fiscal deals, what happens? Republicans give up on tax increases, and in exchange, they get an empty promise of, well, at some point in the future, we're going to restrain the growth of spending. It's sort of like, Cameron's budgets, it's all the tax increases up front, and we're going to restrain spending in the future. That's sort of my impression from looking at UK budget documents. I might be a little bit unfair about that. I don't follow it, obviously, as close as the US. But I do know in the US, whenever we have these fiscal deals, we get the tax increases, we never get the spending restraint. And what happens when you get the tax increases? Two things, very important. Number one, the mere fact that you are putting revenues on the table is like putting blood in the water with hungry sharks around. The politicians start spending the money, even before they collect it. The second thing, they usually don't collect nearly as much money as they think. This is the so-called Laffer curve effect. The Laffer curve does not mean all tax increases lose revenue or all tax cuts increase revenue. Those are only very extreme cases. The Laffer curve, more practically speaking, is simply the notion that if you raise taxes by $100 billion, maybe, just maybe, because of behavioral changes, you only collect 70, or 50, or 80, depending on what tax you try to raise, what are the marginal tax rate and incentive effects and things like that. And likewise, if you're cutting taxes by $100 billion, maybe there's some revenue feedback, and the government only loses, $73.5 billion or something like that. That's what the Laffer curve is really about. So they'll wind up spending more money because they think they're getting more revenue, and they won't get as much additional revenue as they think. And so the combination of those things, combined with the fact that all the so-called spending cuts, which again are just reductions and increases, they're always postponed in the future, and by the time you get to the future, guess what happens? Exactly what's going to happen with the sequester this year. Whenever it actually becomes time to sort of put a little bit of restraint and discipline on the spending side, the politicians just say, oh, we can't do that. It's going to be too mean and draconian and savage and heartless, so they don't do it. So anyhow, that doesn't mean Republicans won't get lured into it. That's what they do. They're the lovable idiots of Washington. So even though in 1982 they got taken to the cleaners, in 1984 they got taken to the cleaners, in 1987 they got taken to the cleaners, in 1990 they got taken to the cleaners, every time they've done one of these fiscal deals, they lost. With one exception, 1997. They did a deal with Bill Clinton that actually did produce a budget surplus, but it was a deal where they cut taxes, not increased taxes. The key thing about what happened in the 1990s is that the growth of spending radically came down. Government only grew 2.9% a year. The private sector was growing faster than that. That's how you balance a budget. The whole key to good fiscal policy, the one rule that I would also apply to the UK as well as the US and every other country, if you want good fiscal policy, don't focus on balancing the budget, because that opens the door for the other side to raise taxes, which usually winds up making things worse. The one good rule of fiscal policy is that the private sector should grow faster than the government. Why? because the private sector is your tax base. And if the economy, the private sector, is growing faster than the government, by definition, even at existing tax rates, you're going to spin off more revenue than spending is increasing. That gets you to good fiscal policy. You do it the other way around, with spending growing faster than revenue, and by the way, this right here is called a French PowerPoint slide, what I'm doing right here. I can make French jokes in England, right? Yes. You certainly can in America. But anyhow, the reason that Greece got in trouble, the reason the U.S. is getting in trouble, the reason so many countries are in fiscal crisis, because over lengthy periods of time, the government was growing faster than the private sector. Obviously, you need to flip those two lines. The reason that, say, New Zealand made great progress in the 1990s, Canada made great progress in the 1990s, the U.S. made great progress that decade, the Baltic countries more recently have made some really good progress. That happens when government grows slower than the private sector. But I'm digressing. Grand bargain. Will Republicans get seduced into it? I worry they will, simply because they're not very smart. And if they do get seduced into a grand bargain, here's my concern. Because if someone came to me and said, Dan, why are you so rigid and inflexible on tax increases? Why wouldn't you just give a little bit? I actually would if I got something. If I knew that agreeing to a tax increase meant we could shut down some useless government departments and agencies and programs, like Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Education, things like that, I would take that deal. If someone was to say to me, okay, we'll reform Medicaid and Medicare along the lines of what Paul Ryan proposed in his budget, will you give some taxes for that? Yeah, I would. But that's never what you get. The current benchmark that people are looking at for a grand bargain is something called the Simpson-Bowles Commission. That was actually the super committee proposal that didn't get enough votes. Well, what's in the Simpson-Bowles proposal? It's a big tax increase and phony entitlement reform. That's sort of the simple, short phrase to describe it. It doesn't do the structural reforms to Medicaid, which is our health care program for poor people in America. It doesn't do the structural reforms to Medicare, which is our health care program for old people in America. Those structural reforms are in the Ryan budget. The House of Representatives passed those structural reforms in 2011. The House of Representatives passed those structural reforms earlier this year. The Senate didn't act on it. The President didn't act on it. If the President and the Democratic Senate were willing to go along with those structural reforms, it might actually make sense for Republicans to budge off their no-tax position. But they won't get that. The Democrats would rather blow the whole thing up than to have those kinds of reforms. And by the way, at some point, we will have the big VAT fight in the U.S. When that happens, that's when all Americans with any sense will move to, I don't know, Costa Rica or something like that and just stock up on ammo. Because that's pretty much when you give up. If you give the politicians that giant new source of revenue in the U.S., then it's really hopeless. And Obama has already said the VAT is quote, something that seems to be working well for other countries. Oh, like Greece, like Spain, like Italy, like Portugal. Europe is heading into the toilet, just like the U.S. is heading in the toilet, but you guys got a head start and you have a VAT, so you'll get there first. Let me go ahead and talk about the economy implications, because I see we're getting up near 7 o'clock when we should stop for Q&A. I think the main issue that we have for our economy is it's almost not even economic. It's really more moral and cultural. And it's what we sometimes joke in the U.S., we call it the Europeanization of America. And it really gets back to that dependency issue that I talked about before. To what extent do you replace to what extent do you erode the social capital of a country? And what do I mean by that? The social capital of the country is the spirit of independence, of self-reliance, of work ethic, of personal initiative and responsibility and entrepreneurship. There's all sorts of things that you sort of throw into this general rubric of social capital, but they mean a lot. Because it basically indicates whether people in a country see it as the job of government to take care of them. And historically, the polling data has always shown a significant difference between the United States and Europe. When you ask questions, is it the government's job to give you housing, health care, a job, so on and so forth? Americans, for the most part, by 20% plus percentage points, have said no. And Europeans, with the UK only slightly better than continental Europe, have said yes. So I worry that that number in America is going to begin to change, especially as that 47 and 49% continue to grow, and obviously the actual share of genuine moochers in the population will grow. So that, I think, is a very real concern. I'm obviously, shifting from the moral and cultural to the economic. The fact that we have this built-in explosion of the welfare state is critical. Let me give you just a couple of numbers on this. When Bill Clinton left office, and I never thought I'd be looking back with great fondness on the fiscal conservatism of Bill Clinton, but government spending did shrink under his reign, from 22% of GDP at the federal level to 18%. Under Bush and Obama, who are virtually identical in terms of their fiscal policy, government spending has gone up to 24 to 25%, federal level. We also have, of course, state and local, roughly 15% of GDP you could add to these numbers to get the total burden of government spending. 24% plus 15%, we're close to 40% in America. Germany's at 42. The UK's what, 47, 48? We're not that far behind European welfare states right now. Of course, France is 56, sort of the gold standard of fiscal irresponsibility. But that's where we are right now, a big slippage from where we are when Bill Clinton left office because of the profligacy of Bush and Obama, both of who had government spending growing faster than the private sector. Where are we heading? According to the Congressional Budget Office long-run forecast, because of entitlements, because of the aging of our population, we're going to see the burden of federal spending go from about 24, 25% today to somewhere between, they do two forecasts, so it's a range, somewhere between 45 and 67% of GDP. That's, of course, 50, 60, 70 years down the road, so it's not like you die, it's a slow-acting cancer we have. That's the good news. But let's think about that slow-acting cancer, and let's look at the optimistic estimate, only 45% of GDP being consumed by the federal government. You add in 15% for state and local, which probably would be 20% by the time we get several decades down the road, and we're worse than France. And if we actually have 67% of GDP, we'll be worse than Cuba, North Korea, and some of the other garden spots of the world. And by the way, keep in mind that those CBO numbers are optimistic because those CBO numbers are based on two assumptions. One, that politicians for the rest of eternity will not add any additional spending burdens on the economy. How likely is that? These guys exist to buy votes with other people's money, so they'll probably make things worse, not better. The second assumption in the CBO forecast, which is laughable, is that the economy's growth rate is exogenous. What does that mean? It basically means that CBO assumes that the economy is going to grow, I think, 2.3% a year on average, regardless of the fact that the burden of government spending is going to double. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to say, well, gee, look at Hong Kong and Singapore. They have small governments. They grow 5 to 6% a year. The U.S., historically, has had medium-sized government. We've grown about 3% a year. And Europe's big government welfare states grow 1.5% a year. Maybe, just maybe, there's a correlation between the burden of government and an economy's growth rate. Not the CBO. No, not at all. So, in all likelihood, while government spending is going like that, that's the numerator in this equation. Economic growth is going to flatten out. That's the denominator in the equation. I sort of use all these math terms there. I know.
Okay, I'm an actuary.
Are you an Austrian? Austrian economists hate math sometimes. I'm an Austrian, but I made these concessions. So we will eventually have a fiscal crisis, a really nasty one. But now let me sort of come back and close on the 2016 and give us a slight, tiny shred of optimism. One bit of good news from this last election is those Republicans that I already mentioned took very, very tough votes for very, very real reform to Medicare and Medicaid. And guess what? They shot at the king, they missed the king, but the king wasn't able to shoot them back. They survived. They, in effect, did a test case. Can you vote for real, deep, meaningful, structural reform of entitlement programs and survive the demagoguery they did? Remember the Democrats? You may have seen, if you follow U.S. elections, they had the commercials with the Republicans pushing Granny off the cliff. Literally, that was the commercial. You know, some woman, an old woman in a wheelchair, and they run up to a cliff and push her off the cliff. Now, normally, politically, that kind of demagoguery is successful. Republicans did it. They survived. The demagoguery didn't work. So the lesson, hopefully, in their little tiny pea brains will be, hey, we can vote for these reforms again and win again. So let's now think about 2016. I mentioned already there's luck sometimes involved. Republicans didn't have any good candidates this year. In 2016, I think the luck turns the other way. Republicans have on their bench, their farm team, as we sometimes call it, Rand Paul, Marco Rubio, Bobby Jindal, Chris Christie, Paul Ryan, all candidates that at least to some extent, for the first time since Reagan ran for his second term, might be considered conservatives who actually believe in shrinking the burden of government. Not like the Bushes, not like McCain, not like Dole, not like Romney. We've had a whole series of big government Republicans running at the top of the ticket for the GOP. In 2016, there's actually quite a high likelihood that you'll actually get someone who doesn't just mouth the Reagan rhetoric, but actually to some extent believes it. Now let's think about the Democratic side. Joe Biden, don't laugh. Joe Biden, crazy old Uncle Joe, Mr. Tourette's? No, he will not be a serious candidate. Hillary Clinton doesn't have nearly the charisma of Bill Clinton. I just don't think she'll be a successful national candidate. So in all likelihood, even though those two would far and away be the front runners right now, that's mostly polling data based on name ID. I suspect we'll see some of the Democratic governors, maybe Cuomo of New York, Hickenlooper of Colorado, O'Malley of Maryland. I don't think they quite match up to Bill Clinton or Barack Obama in terms of charisma, likability, specialness, whatever you want to call it. So the GOP actually has a chance in 2016 to have someone good run for the White House, win the White House. In 2014, in the midterm elections, almost certainly you would think Republicans will win because they'll be the out-of-party power, and especially in the 6th year of a president, historically, that is always good for the out-of-power party. So you could very well have 2014, a good Republican midterm, and then 2016, a Republican president taking office with a Republican Congress. But unlike the Bush years, where that opportunity, instead of becoming a chance for reform, became an opportunity for wasteful spending, under the right kind of president, we could actually therefore then, if that happens, get these real entitlement reforms and sort of steer America away from our Greek future, which would be a very nice thing. And with that, I've sort of gone 5 minutes over. Apologies for that, but thank you very much. I'll be happy to take questions.